Welcome friends to the Secret Doctrine webinar. Today is our 5th class and we are going to explore stanza 6. Stanza 6, as we are going to see, has two parts. In the first part, there is an explanation of the formation of the worlds in general, and in the second part of the stanza, there is focusing on the Earth, specifically at the point in evolution in which we are now. So in this first this first class, we will see the general part of the stanza, and in our next class we will see the second one, the one that is more specifically focused on the Earth. But before we start, let us read the summary that Blavatsky has about the different stanzas. This is a short one. She says, "The subsequent stages in the formation of a world are indicated in stanza 6, which brings the evolution of such a world down to its fourth great period, corresponding to the period in which we are now living." So the stanzas go from a universal description to a more and more particular description. By particular, I mean that as the stanzas go on, they begin to focus more and more on what happened on Earth in particular. So the previous stanzas, for example, the first stanzas can be applied to the universe as a whole. Then as we come closer to stanza 4, 5, they are, although they are still universal, they are talking a little more specifically about the development of our solar system. And then in this stanza, the first part talks about the formation of worlds in general, and as I said, the second part will be focused on the Earth. And the 7th stanza, we will see, is very specifically about the development of this humanity on this Earth. So let's go to the first shloka. The title of the stanza as a whole is Our World, Its Growth and Development. And the shloka says, "By the power of the Mother of Mercy and Knowledge, Kuan Yin, the triple of Kuan Sha Yin, residing in Kuan Yin Tian, Fohat, the breath of their progeny, the son of the sons, having called forth the lower abyss, chaos, the elusive form of Xian Chan, our universe, and the 7 elements." So this continues in the next shloka. But first, let us begin to explore the different elements here. As a way of general introduction to this stanza, Blavatsky points out to the fact that the terms used are Chinese terms, as we can see Kuan Yin and Kuan Sha Yin, etc. And she explains, no exoteric religious system has ever adopted a female creator, and thus woman was regarded and treated from the first dawn of popular religions as inferior to men. It is only in China and Egypt that Kuan Yin and Isis were placed on a par with male gods. The Brahmanical Brahmanical is another way of saying what we say today, Hindu. So the Hindu Vaj seems, in many an aspect, to approach the Chinese Kuan Yin. But there is no regular worship of Vaj under this name in India, as there is of Kuan Yin in China. So this is referring to a general problem that Blavatsky had when translating the stanzas. According to her, the stanzas were originally written in Zenzar. It seems that the Zenzar is a pictorial language, a language of symbols, but there is probably also a written aspect of Censar, because sometimes Blavatsky refers to Censar words. But whatever the case, Blavatsky always says there are specific names and terms for all these different elements that we see in the stanzas that are the ones that the esoteric philosophy uses. But most of those terms seem to be in this language, in Censar. So it would be confusing if Blavatsky begins to just produce all these words that are completely unknown for us. So when trying to translate the stanzas into English, she always tried to find a term in the world religions that was close to what the esoteric term meant. So in this case, for example, she has to find a term that describes a female creator, and a female creator that is held on a par, she says, to the male creator. So a female creator that has been worshipped in our history. And she says, well, there was Isis in Egypt that was regarded as a goddess and that she was worshipped. In China, there is Kuan Yin, which is again a female aspect of Avalokiteshvara, a bodhisattva. So she says, when I have to find a suitable female goddess that has similar connotations, the only tradition that is useful is that of Chinese Buddhism with the image of Kuan Yin. So the stanzas are written in several languages. We have at the beginning of the first stanza a shloka that is completely in Tibetan, so we know there is a Tibetan translation of the stanza. There is obviously a Chinese translation of the stanzas that Blavatsky is referring to here. And presumably there is a Sanskrit translation of the stanzas, and maybe in some other languages. So when Blavatsky chooses which one of these to use for her own translation into English, for these particular stanzas she chose the Chinese translation for the reason that I was mentioning, because it is only at this moment in Chinese philosophy that there is a goddess that is actively worshipped. Now, since Blavatsky wrote The Secret Doctrine to this time, there is a revival of the divine feminine, but when we talk about traditional religions, the Chinese religion the Chinese Buddhism seem to be the most appropriate for this. So this is why we will see that there are several Chinese names in this particular stanza. So let's begin defining some of these terms. She talks about Kuan Yin, she says, by the power of the Mother of Mercy and Knowledge, and Kuan Yin, who is said to be the triple of Kuan Shai Yin. And then she explains, Mother of Mercy and Knowledge is called the triple of Kuan Shai Yin because in her correlations, metaphysical and cosmical, she is the mother, the wife, and the daughter of the Logos, the Shakti or energy, the essence of the three. So the first division that Blavatsky makes here between these terms is that Kuan Yin is the feminine Logos and Kuan Shai Yin is the male Logos. This is something that in modern Buddhism, in modern Chinese Buddhism, is not really present. Most people today regard Kuan Yin and Kuan Shai Yin as two different names of the same deity. So in modern Chinese Buddhism, there isn't this differentiation that Blavatsky makes between Kuan Yin as being female and Kuan Shai Yin as being male. Many times you will see both Avalokiteshvara, which is the Indian origin of the Buddhist Kuan Yin, sometimes you see Avalokiteshvara being double, half of it is with beard, the other half is with female features, or you can see sometimes Kuan Yin represented as a male, or vice versa, Avalokiteshvara as a female. So it is true that the gender is confused when referring to Kuan Yin, although normally Kuan Yin is regarded as female. Perhaps this differentiation between Kuan Yin as female and Kuan Sha Yin as male is true from an esoteric point of view. Maybe this was true in ancient times before we have written records, and then in time it was lost, and then Kuan Yin is taken as a synonym of Kuan Sha Yin. So far, what we can see in the written documents that we have is that they seem to be synonyms within traditional Buddhism. But anyway, from the point of view of the secret doctrine, Kuan Yin is a female logos, Kuan Sha Yin is a male logos. And these are two aspects of the same. It's not really that there are two logoi, there is only one logos, but then when we refer to the female aspect, we call it, in this case, Kuan Yin. When referring to the male aspect, we call it Kuan Sha Yin. Now, the second point is that Kuan Yin is called the triple of the male logos. And Blavatsky says that this is because she is the mother, the wife, and the daughter of the logos, allegorically speaking. The idea here is that the first principle before differentiation begins is always to be regarded as feminine, Blavatsky says. If you remember in the first shloka of the first stanza, when it is said the eternal parent wrapped in her ever invisible robes, that eternal parent is feminine, her invisible robes. So she says the feminine is always first, and the feminine here would correspond to what is the potential, what is possible but is not yet manifested. Within this potential awakens the active seed, awakens the force that will develop, that was dormant. This force that awakens within the potential, within the female potential, like in the bosom of the female aspect of the universe, is the male logos. The male aspect awakens and goes to sleep, is active and falls back into inactivity. So when it awakens, it's like the birth of the male aspect of the logos in the universe, for example. So in that connection, at the first awakening of the male aspect of the logos, the female is the mother, because this awakens in the bosom of the female principle, in the bosom of the infinite potentiality. So at that point, the female is the mother of the logos. Now, once the logos is awakened and begins to be active, it is said that the female becomes the wife of the logos, because the universe will come from the interaction between the female principle and the male principle. Since at this point in the cosmic evolution, both female and male principles are actively the progenitors, so to say, the parents of the manifested cosmos, then the female principle becomes the wife of the logos. And then it is said that the female aspect is also the daughter of the logos, because it is the activity of the logos that begins to differentiate that originally undifferentiated female principle and produces the differentiated matter. So the manifested matter, which is an aspect of the feminine aspect of the universe, as manifestation is now the daughter of the logos. It is the energy of the logos that differentiates matter. So now the feminine principle is the daughter of the logos. So this is an allegorical way to talk about the interaction between the male and female principles at in the sequence of differentiation from the beginning to the manifestation of the universe. So for this reason, Kuan Yin is said to be the triple of Quan Sha Yin. And you will see that in some allegories in Hinduism or in Egypt, you will see deities that were a male deity marrying his mother, or things like that, which when originally when the Christian missionaries began to translate these allegories in Hinduism, for example, they thought that they were completely immoral, because how can a male god marry the mother? But these all have that deep philosophical and metaphysical connotation. It's not, in the West, we have a tendency to materialize the allegories, but in the East, at least at that time, they always took the allegories and tried to spiritualize them, tried to look at the allegories not from the material aspect, but from the spiritual aspect that they were a symbol of. So that's why Kuan Yin is the triple of the main logos. And then she refers, or the shloka, the commentary to the shloka refers to the Shakti or energy, which is the essence of the feminine aspect in these three differentiated ways. And Shakti, again, is energy, but is a feminine energy. In Hinduism, Shakta would be the male and Shakti is the female. So the Shaktis are a female manifestation of energy. Now, the shloka says that Kuan Yin resides in Kuan Yin Tian. And Blavatsky explains that this word means the melodious heaven of sound, the abode of Kuan Yin, or the divine voice, literally. So here she is relating Kuan Yin to the divine voice. Remember that we already saw this word, voice, applied to a feminine aspect of the logos. Remember, we had the divine thought, that was the male aspect. Then we had the voice, from which came the army of the voice being the feminine aspect. And when the divine thought, which is mute, comes through the voice, it becomes a word. So the word was the sun. Remember, we saw this in previous classes. So we had this divine thought as the male, the voice as this ability to turn the divine thought into something concrete, the voice being the mother, and then the word being the sun, which is the manifested universe or hierarchies of being, or whatever we are talking in particular there. So Kuan Yin Tian is the plane of the sound, the plane on which the melodious heaven of sound, the plane which is the origin of sound. And this is where Kuan Yin resides. In generally, if we talk about the three higher planes, we could say that the second plane is the female plane. The first plane is normally regarded as an absolute plane. Then we have the second plane, which is the plane of the undifferentiated expression of that absolute nature. So the second plane is normally a female plane. And then the third plane is when the logos awakens and becomes active. So this is probably referring to the second plane in the cosmic structure. Now Blavatsky explains, this voice is a synonym of the verbum or word, the speech, as the expression of thought. The female logos, so to speak, the goddess of the active forces in nature, the word, voice or sound, and speech. Kuan Yin is the magic potency of occult sound in nature and ether, which voice calls forth Xian Chan, the elusive form of the universe, out of chaos and the seven elements. So here is the reference to voice or to the word, meaning whenever we talk about this process of divine thought, the voice and the word, we are talking about energy. We are talking about the process of manifesting in a concrete way whatever was concealed in the divine thought. Now, this voice, she says, is the magic potency of occult sound in nature. Remember, we mentioned that in the esoteric view, the sound has some magical properties. The sound on the physical plane is the denser aspect of a force that has some magical properties. So whenever we talk about voice, about the word, there is a correlation to a creative force, a force that may bring results into action. Fortunately, human beings don't know much how to use the voice or the word to produce magical effects, because then we tend to use them in a selfish way and in a destructive way. But every time we talk about the voice, it is associated with this creative energy that Kuan Yin is representing here. And she says it is through this voice, through this magic potency, that the elusive form of the universe is brought forth from the chaos and the seven elements. Chaos is a Greek word which is in philosophy is used in a different way from the way that we normally use it. We think that chaos is something that is out of order, or it many times has even negative connotations. For the Greeks, chaos was this primordial substance which doesn't have any structure. This is why chaos as opposed to form, to structure. So chaos is this primordial substance which, because it is not differentiated, it cannot form any structure. We are going to see a little more about this when we talk about the seven elements. So out of this primordial and differentiated substance and the seven elements that will differentiate from this chaos, the divine voice of Kuan Yin will produce the manifested universe. Now the shloka goes on saying, Fohat, the breath of their progeny, the son of the suns, having called forth from the lower abyss, from chaos, the elusive form of Sien Chan, our universe, and the seven elements. So now in this second part of the shloka, we switched to the masculine or the male aspect. This is a pattern in the secret doctrine, as I mentioned. Everything begins with the female potency, with the feminine potentiality, and as evolution proceeds, as differentiation proceeds, it gets activated and becomes a male energy, so to say. Blavatsky uses the word Fohat, as we explained in previous classes, because it is the male counterpart of the female Shaktis. Now, there is no religious tradition that has a concept like Fohat, meaning that has a description of energies which are male. Male, again, don't relate this to the human body. Male energies or masculine energies, philosophically speaking. As I mentioned, the Shaktis are feminine. So Fohat is the male counterpart of the Shaktis. And in the manifested universe, it is Fohat, the one that will produce the differentiation of matter. So Fohat is the breath of their progeny. They are referring to the father-mother, to the male and female logos. and their progeny are the suns. So the suns are these primordial seven and all the different hierarchies of beings. So Fohat is the son of the suns, the seven sons that are the progeny of the father-mother, the female and male logos. So Fohat calls from the lower abyss, chaos, the elusive form of the universe. Since it is said here the lower abyss, we may think that this is referring to the primordial matter on the four lower manifested planes. Remember that one of the typical structures that we will see within the secret doctrine is that within the seven manifested planes, there are three higher planes that are formless and four lower planes that are with form. Since the shloka is talking about the lower abyss, it's probably referring particularly to the formation of the four lower planes. Although we will see the seven elements and Fohat is involved in developing the seven elements, remember that we already saw that the special plane of Fohat is the fourth. We also saw that the planetary chains begin on the fourth plane. Since this shloka is talking about the formation of worlds, even though there is a mention of the three higher planes, the focus is put on the four lower planes. So this is the lower abyss, the primordial matter for the formation of the four lower planes. And so the elusive universe on these four lower planes is formed, and also the seven elements. There are several ways of presenting these seven elements and the correlations. I'm bringing here one of the ways in which Blavatsky presented these seven elements. There are other ways in which she did also, because any classification is to some extent artificial. It's a way to try to explain something that, ultimately speaking, is a whole, is a unity. So you can really separate that unity in different ways according to your specific purpose. But since this mentioned the elements as we know them, I think this will be a good table to take as an example. So when we talk about the seven elements, normally we know about four elements or perhaps five elements. In the esoteric philosophy, it is said that there are seven elements. There are four or five elements only because at this point of evolution, there are four elements fully developed or manifested, and there is a fifth element that is in the process of manifestation, as we are going to see. This is why most traditions talk only about four or five elements. But from the esoteric point of view, we have the earth, which would be the lower element. In Hinduism, the earth is called Bhumi or Prithvi. And these Bhumi or Prithvi are also not only an element, but is also a goddess. And this idea of element / God is very esoteric. The esoteric tradition also sees each plane as being, if we want to put it this way, the body of a Dhyan Chohan. Remember that from the esoteric point of view, there is no matter that has not a consciousness counterpart and also an energy counterpart. So whenever there is energy, there is matter and consciousness. Whenever there is matter, there is consciousness and energy. And the same with consciousness. In the esoteric view, there is no pure spirit with no matter. As soon as spirit or consciousness is manifested, it manifests through some kind of matter or substance. Of course, not matter in the dense physical way that we know it. When consciousness and matter, or spirit and substance, unify, then we have a state that is pre-differentiation and pre-manifestation. So Blavatsky shows here the element also as a kind of realm for the different hierarchies of beings. So she says that the earth, the earth element, not necessarily as a planet, but as a plane, the physical plane, is the realm of men and animals. So we can correlate also the elements with planes. We can correlate the elements with states of matter within the physical plane, as we are going to see. Always remember that the esoteric philosophy looks at things in a way that has been called holographic. In the sense, this concept of hologram that is used sometimes within the theosophical literature is the idea of a whole which is composed by parts, but if you zoom in one of the parts, you will see that the whole is reflected in that part. So you take a part and you will see all the elements of the whole in that particular part. So you can see all the 7 elements on one plane, or the 7 elements as being the 7 planes. So the hierarchy, the kind of beings that live primarily on the earth element, on the physical plane, are men and animals. And if we correlate this to the human constitution, that would equate the body. Then the next element, subtler than the earth, is water, in Sanskrit apas. And Blavatsky says this is the realm of elementals, nature spirits, and elementaries. Elementals and nature spirits are forces of nature, semi-material, we could say, forces of nature. And the elementaries are the souls of the departed, especially those who are attached to the physical plane. The theosophical teachings teach that when a person dies, it goes to a higher plane, unless the death was unnatural or the person was too attached to the physical plane, then that person may become an elementary. This, we could think, this plane of the elementaries, the water in this case, as being the lowest aspect of the inner planes, one that is very close to the physical plane. In the human constitution, this would correlate with the Linga Sharira in Sanskrit, or the astral image, or the astral double that is associated to the physical plane. Then the next element, air, Vayu, in Sanskrit, has to do with higher elementals and with what we could call the kamic plane, the plane in which Kama as a principle, the principle of passions and desires, is active. Then we have the fourth element, fire, which has 2 names in Sanskrit, Agni or Agni or Tejas. This has to do, or is the realm of the holiest among the Rupa Devas. Rupa means form, and Devas means celestial being or angel. So, as we were saying, the fourth plane is the highest of the planes with form. The 4 lower planes are all planes of form, and on the fourth one are the holiest, the highest angels with form. In a human being, that has to do with lower manas, with the concrete mind, the mind that perceives everything through words, through images, through forms. Then the fifth element is ether, and ether is the abode of the Kumaras, or the sons of Mahat. So these sons of Mahat can be correlated to the primordial 7. These are the first manifestation of the active principle. Remember, we said that the second plane is more of a plane of a female manifestation, a plane of potentiality. And this in human beings have to do with higher manas. So these are the 5 elements that you can see, for example, in Hinduism: earth, water, air, fire, and ether. Ether is an element, as we are going to see, that is not fully manifested yet. Then Blavatsky talks about a 6th element that she calls the divine flame, an eternal, inconsumable substance. The hierarchies on these 2 higher planes are too far removed from our vision, so Blavatsky many times would not really bother trying to describe them. This has to do with buddhi in the human constitution. And finally, space, or akasha, as the highest manifested element, the plane of the noumenal. The noumenal is the origin, the cause of all the rest, what she calls the atmic aura. Akasha sometimes is placed by Blavatsky as the 5th plane. It depends, again, how you are dividing the planes according to your purpose. In this case, Akasha here, more than an element, it means the space, which is the synthesis of all the elements from a certain point of view. It's the container of all the elements. So that would be the highest element. So this is an example of these 7 elements that the shlokas talk about. So let us come now to the second shloka. It says, the swift and the radiant one produces the 7 Layu centers, against which none will prevail, to the great day be with us, and sits the universe on these eternal foundations, surrounding Sien Chan with the elementary germs. So let's see what this means. The shloka begins with the swift and the radiant one produces the 7 Laya centers. By the swift and the radiant one, we may interpret this as being Fohat and or the gods. And the swift and the radiant one is here the name for one single principle. You see that it says produces later, so it is one principle. When we talk about the higher planes, all separation is not true. When we separate the hierarchies of beings from Fohat, for example, when we say that Fohat is the son of the hierarchies of beings, it's just an allegorical way of talking about this. Fohat is manifested through the activity of the hierarchies of beings. So both things are really one. So, but the radiant one, many times, for example, in Hinduism or in Sanskrit, the word Deva means the radiant ones or the brilliant ones. So by radiant one, in the celestial beings may be referring to, but I think in this particular shloka, we can interpret the swift and the radiant one as being Fohat. And it is Fohat which produces the 7 Layu centers. So Blavatsky explains, Layu comes from the Sanskrit Laya, the point of matter where every differentiation has ceased. We saw already that the meaning of Laya, as Blavatsky explains here, is a state in which there is no differentiation. It's a pre-differentiated state of matter, of energy, of consciousness. So this pre-differentiated state may be an absolute state or a relative state, as we are going to see. But basically, the idea with the name Laya is a state in which differentiation and therefore manifestation is in its latent possibility. And the Laya centers, although they are called centers, and Blavatsky uses the word point and places, she explains in the commentaries that it's not really a point in space, it's not really a center in the three-dimensional space. It is rather a state which is available anywhere in the universe. But when this Laya center begins to differentiate, that differentiation will happen in a particular place within space. But as a state, the Laya center is everywhere. So she says the 7 Laya centers are the 7 points at which, in esotericism, the scale of reckoning of differentiation begins. So now there is the introduction of 7 of these centers. 7 centers on which differentiation begins. This is, as we are going to see, these are 7 relatively undifferentiated states of matter. And each one of these 7 centers will give origin to each one of the planes or each one of the elements in the universe. From the centers, beyond which esoteric philosophy allows us to perceive the dim metaphysical outlines of the 7 sons of life and light, the 7 logoi, from these centers begins the differentiation of the elements which enter into the constitution of our solar system. So, as I said, it is from these 7 centers that the 7 elements will differentiate. Now, these 7 logoi, the 7 sons of life and light, Blavatsky explains in the commentaries that are some celestial beings which are beyond the 7 manifested planes, beyond the 7 elements. She says that we can only perceive the dim metaphysical outlines of them. In the commentaries, she says anything that is beyond the 7 manifested planes, for us, is just absolute. Is something that we cannot perceive, we cannot conceive. However, at that point, on that plane, there is some kind of differentiation, which we would never call differentiation. For us, it's completely undifferentiated. But on that point, there is some kind of life, there is some kind of entities and differentiation. Perhaps we could say that even on the physical plane, something that is absolute darkness for us may have some light for other animals, for example. There are animals that are able to see where we cannot. And maybe even that view, that vision, is not even a vision that comes out of what we call light. Maybe like in the case of the bats, for example, is a different kind of visual image that comes from sound, for example. So we perhaps may use that as a allegory to say that that which for us is completely absolute and differentiated, for a being that is able to be aware on those high planes, that being would find life and activity. But anyway, this is just a side commentary. The idea is that these Laya centers, the 7 Laya centers, will be the origin of the 7 elements. Now, Fohat is said to produce these 7 Laya centers. And Blavatsky explains, when Fohat is said to produce 7 Laya centers, it means that for formative or creative purposes, the great law, theists may call it God, stops or rather modifies its perpetual motion on 7 invisible points within the area of the manifested universe. So first, see here in the parentheses, Blavatsky was always reluctant to talk about God, particularly because we all in our culture tend to have a very anthropomorphic idea of God. So she would rather call it the great law rather than God. But anyway, the point here is that Fohat produces what as she says here, in 7 different points of the universe. And remember again that the idea of 7 different points is not points in space. It's difficult to put words to this, but it is a way of saying there are 7 different states of undifferentiated, substance which will give origin to the 7 different elements. And the way that this happens, Blavatsky says that on these allegorical points, Fohat modifies the perpetual motion that exists in the universe on these 7 invisible points to give rise to the 7 elements. And then she quotes from the Occult Catechism, the great breath, which is the essence of Fohat. Remember, in the first class of the first series, we saw that the great breath is an aspect of the Absolute, which within the manifested universe becomes Fohat. So the great breath digs through space 7 holes into Laya to cause them to circumgerate during Manvantara. So the idea here is that we have the Laya state as a whole, as a totality, and then Fohat digs in this Laya state 7 holes. This is an interesting way of putting it, because from a certain point of view, we may think that whatever is undifferentiated is filling the whole space, and that whatever we call differentiation or matter are holes within this substance that fills the space. And therefore, what we call matter is actually emptiness. This of course reminds that Buddhist idea that emptiness is form, form is emptiness. From this point of view, it looks like what constitutes matter is actually holes in space, perhaps like bubbles. If we could produce, we are in the ocean, suppose, and there is a structure, suppose that we could build a structure made of bubbles. These bubbles are actually places in which the water is not. These are little holes within the water, for example. So that seems to be the image that this commentary in the Occult Catechism brings. But basically, the idea is that Fohat, in its ability to produce motion, remember that Fohat in previous stanzas was related to the spiral motion. Fohat changes the motion of the great breath, a motion that retains the substance in the undifferentiated state. Now Fohat changes that motion, and by that change of motion, differentiation begins. This seems to be what Blavatsky implies when she says that Fohat stops, or rather modifies, the perpetual motion of the great breath on 7 invisible points within the area of the manifested universe. Now, these 7 Laya centers, or Layu centers, against which none will prevail, to the great day be with us, and seats the universe on these eternal foundations. We already talked about the great day be with us, which is the point in which the whole universe is dissolved back into the state of one perfection, the state of rest, the state of not even being, but being one with everything, the be with us. At this point, the whole universe is in Laya, is in a state of Laya. So these 7 centers will remain existing until the whole universe becomes a big Laya center. And on these 7 centers, the universe is placed on the eternal foundations. So Blavatsky says, such 7 neutral centers then are produced by Fohat, who, when, as Milton has it, fair foundations are laid whereon to build, quickens matter into activity and evolution. So you see 7 neutral centers because these Laya centers are places or states of matter in which differentiation, polarization of positive and negative is not. So they are neutral, they are not, the substance here is not polarized. So Fohat quickens matter into activity and therefore evolution on these 7 points which are the foundation to build the manifested universe. If we talk about the planes, you see here, for example, between these thick dark lines, we have 2 planes in the diagram. And Blavatsky explains in the commentaries that each one of the planes has 7 subdivisions, 7 subplanes, as we could call them. So the first subplane of each plane can be regarded as the Laya center of that plane. So let's take the lowest plane as the physical plane. So if this is the physical plane, the highest subdivision of the physical plane, the highest subplane within this plane would be the true atomic plane. As I mentioned before, the word atom means non-divisible. Tomos is divisions. So when science called the modern atoms in that way, is because they thought that these were particles that could not be divided. It turns out that the atoms can be divided. Therefore, the name atom for what we call atoms is rather a misnomer. So Blavatsky many times, when science still thought that the atoms were indivisible, Blavatsky always said the atoms of science are divisible, therefore they are not atoms. So many times Blavatsky would call them molecules, because molecules in science are a collection of different atoms that can be separated. So Blavatsky would say, well, the atoms themselves are like molecules. But the idea is that on the highest subplane of the physical plane are the true atoms, the ultimate indivisible physical particle. In quantum physics, we are approaching that plane perhaps. We are going deeper and deeper into matter and getting to particles which are not even, the word particle is not even correct at that point, although in quantum physics that is recognized, and yet we don't have any other good word. And they are approaching a state which will be indivisible, and that will be the ultimate physical particle. Now, it is said that there are 7 of these subplanes on each plane. The lowest of them all, according to the esoteric philosophy, is what we call the solid state of matter. So all these subplanes are like states of matter. Within the physical plane, the lowest of them all is what we call solids. Then the next one is what we call liquids, in which the way that the atoms and molecules relate to each other is in a looser way. Then we have the third state, which is the gaseous state. And then science knows of a fourth state, which is what we call plasma. As we go up, the way that these atoms and the subatomic particles also relate begins to be looser and looser as we go up in these subplanes. So science so far has discovered 4 subplanes of the physical plane. And these 4, remember that the lower 4 subdivisions of any system are the ones that are with form, relatively speaking. So we can expect that the 3 higher subplanes are formless. Perhaps, as I was saying, these quantic particles, which cannot really be called particles at this point, we are not really talking about little pieces of matter. We are talking about something that is really energy, that is force, but that is acting as if it was bottled up. So perhaps all these subatomic particles, that quarks, etc., that quantum physics is discovering, is part of the formless subplanes of the physical plane. Now, there are some enthusiasts in quantum physics, or in the people who are trying to relate quantum physics to spirituality, who think that once we get to the ultimate quantum particle, we will discover God, or the source of the universe. They think that this and the highest or the most fundamental physical particle, its discovery will have some kind of divine revelation. Now, from the theosophical point of view, once we discover the highest physical particle, all we discover is the end of the lowest of the planes in the universe. Beyond that is not God, it's just the astral plane. So if the whole universe was only physical matter, then yes, it makes sense that the discovery of the ultimate physical particle would mean the discovery of the source of the universe. But that is not the case in the esoteric tradition and many others. The physical plane is not the whole of the universe. So sometimes even the people who, or these scientists who are trying to interpret science in a more spiritual way, are still conditioned by a materialistic view in which the physical is the only thing that exists in the universe, even though there may be a spiritual counterpart to the physical. Anyway, the idea then is that there are 7 planes, and the highest subplanes of each of them represent these 7 Laya centers, which are undifferentiated in relation to that plane in particular. But if we go higher in the planes, from a higher plane, the Laya center of the lower plane perhaps would not be perceived as undifferentiated. And then she says that, or the shloka says that Fohat places these 7 centers, or generates these 7 centers, and surrounds them, or surrounds the Sien Chan, which is the illusory universe that is being born, with the elementary germs. And she explains that these elementary germs, with which Fohat fills Sien Chan, the illusory universe, from Tien Sin, that was the heaven of mind, literally, or that which is absolute. Remember, from beyond the 7 manifested planes come or within, let's say, that which is beyond the 7 manifested planes, come the 7 Laya centers, which begin to develop the elements, and around which the elementary germs are produced. And she says that these elementary germs are the atoms of science and the monads of Leibniz. So in the way that Blavatsky tended to interpret the monads of Leibniz, seems to be the monads are like the spiritual counterparts of the physical atoms that science knows about. So she says that she's explaining here that around the universe now, or around the Laya centers in the universe now, the atoms, whether they are physical or they are spiritual, begin to develop. So we see this even in regular science. We see that when they explain how the Big Bang is produced, of course, the Big Bang explains how physical matter came into being, only the physical plane, not what happened on the higher planes. But when the Big Bang begins, science says that matter was in the state of quantum particles, and at that point, at the beginning of the universe, the state of energy was so high that these subatomic particles could not come together, could not unite to others in order to form structures. So, for example, protons and neutrons, which are the building blocks of the atoms, were not even formed because the quarks that formed them were separated. But then, as the evolution of the universe goes on, then we see the beginning, the formation of protons and nucleus and neutrons, and that begins to produce the nucleus and later on the whole atoms that we know about. So probably what the Shloka is referring to here is to that stage in which atoms are formed, after which we can form structures and build forms through which consciousness can evolve. And then we get to the third Shloka, because all these 7 elements that we are talking about are not produced at once. There is a very gradual development. Let's say there is a gradual manifestation and a gradual development of each of these elements, and there are cycles to perfect each one of the elements. Nature has a way to work in which normally first a blueprint is drawn, a blueprint of all the elements. Then that blueprint begins to be given a little more concrete form, and then in a later cycle, nature begins to really work on each of the elements to give them the fully manifested forms. So all this happens very gradually and through cycles. Now the Shloka says, of the 7 elements, first 1 manifested, 6 concealed, 2 manifested, 5 concealed, 3 manifested, 4 concealed, 4 produced, 3 hidden, 4 and 1 zan, which is fraction, revealed, 2 1/2 concealed, 6 to be manifested, 1 laid aside. Lastly, 7 small wheels revolving, 1 giving birth to the other. So we see here how the elements manifest one after the other, one by one. There is at the fourth element, there is a particular mention to 4.5 being manifested, and then the other half is still to be manifested. We will see that. And then 6 to be manifested and 1 laid aside. This is probably referring to the highest element, which is never truly manifested. The highest element within the 7, as we saw in this diagram that Blavatsky brought, space or akasha, the highest element is the synthesis of the 6 differentiations. It's the container. This is why Blavatsky equated with space. So if we talk strictly speaking, although we talk about 7 manifested elements, the highest one is not truly manifested, or at least not in the way that the other 6 are. And lastly, 7 small wheels, which we will see. So Blavatsky explains, although these stanzas refer to the whole universe after Mahapralaya, the universal destruction, yet this sentence, as any student of occultism may see, refers also by analogy to the evolution and final formation of the primitive, though compound, 7 elements on our earth. So here Blavatsky is making the transition between the universal and the particular. If we interpret these elements in an abstract way, then this can be applied to the whole universe. Now, if we interpret this in a more concrete way, we are beginning to refer to what happens on Earth. And I think the reason why Blavatsky brings this up here is because of the mentioning of the 4.5 elements manifested. Because that is precisely, as she's going to explain, the particular stage of evolution in which the elements are here on Earth. So this now is beginning to refer more specifically to what is going on in our planet. So she says, no world, as no heavenly body, could be constructed on the objective plane, on the physical plane, had not the elements being sufficiently differentiated already from their primeval ilos resting in Laia. So this ilos is a Greek word that we can interpret as the undifferentiated matter that is resting in the Laia state. So basically she says, if we are going to build a physical planet, all the elements have to be sufficiently differentiated, not completely, not manifested to the full perfection, because as I explained, this happens by cycles. Little by little, there is a repetition of evolution of the elements, and on each cycle, one of the elements in particular gets perfected. But nature keeps working on all the 7 elements throughout all the evolutionary cycles. Now, before the physical planets can be formed, nature has to develop, at least to some extent, sufficiently differentiate all the elements on the inner planes. And then Blavatsky says, the worlds, including our own, were, of course, as germs, primarily evolved from the one element in its second stage, father-mother. So at the beginning of the process of evolution, all the worlds, including our Earth, were more as germs, as protoplanets in a sense, if we want to use a scientific language. They were not really worlds yet, as we have seen in previous stanzas, but they are, as she says, they are these germs evolved from the one element, from the unity, from the undifferentiation that is the source of everything, in its second stage, the father-mother. Blavatsky normally interprets, when trying to look at all these stages on the physical plane, she says that the first formless manifestation of matter that we call, for example, the cosmic dust or the star dust, this first formless manifestation of matter on the physical plane corresponds to the second stage, the father-mother. The first stage is invisible, is unmanifested, undifferentiated. As soon as differentiation begins, which may be related, she normally relates this to the first stage of the cosmic matter, whether in a galaxy, solar system, or a planet, that is the second stage, the father-mother. She says the differentiated world soul, whether we call it with modern science cosmic dust and fire mist, or with occultism, Akasha and Jivatma. So Akasha is the manifested space, but also is the cosmic matter, the primordial cosmic matter, which on the physical plane is related to, as she says, the cosmic dust, but on the inner planes is a spiritual substance. And Jivatma is interpreted in several ways. In this case, it's probably interpreted as the one life, the one manifested life that will animate the whole cosmos. Now, Blavatsky says, but this first stage of evolution, the father-mother, the first stage, which is the second, as we saw in previous classes, this first stage of evolution from the unity was in due course of time followed by the next. And then what comes next is the gradual differentiation of one element after the other. And then she explains in particular this aspect: 4 1/10 fraction revealed, 2 1/2 concealed. Of these 4 elements, she says, at this particular cycle of evolution, 4 elements are now fully manifested, not perfected, but fully manifested. These 4 elements is what we call earth, water, air, fire. They are fully manifested. We manipulate them in daily life. We know them, we see them, perceive them. While the 5th, the ether, is only partially manifested. as we are hardly in the second half of the fourth round, and consequently, the fifth element will manifest fully only in the fifth round. So, elements are perfected on their own round. We can say that the first element is differentiated, manifested, and perfected during the first round. Then all the other elements are also differentiated during the first round, but they are more like germs. Then on the second round, the second element is manifested, differentiated, manifested, and perfected. So on this fourth round, the fourth element is in the process of being perfected, which would be fire. However, there is the fifth element that is already in the process of manifestation. This element will be perfected in the fifth round. But because within this fourth round, we are in a sub-cycle that is the fifth, is what we call the fifth root race. Because of that, this is the time in evolution, in human evolution, when we will begin to perceive the fifth element, which Blavatsky calls ether. And I said the fourth element as fire. The fourth element I meant as the plasma. You have earth. If you take in the regular elements, you have earth, water, air, and fire. If now we look at the elements as being states of matter on the physical plane, that would correlate to plasma. We know at this point we have learned to manipulate plasma. We create TVs and many things with manipulating this plasma. That would be the fourth state of matter corresponding to the fourth element. Now, Blavatsky says that little by little, the fifth element and perhaps the fifth state of matter will begin to be manifested, begin to manifest. So the future humanity will begin to perceive and be able to use this fifth element. So we are at the point where 4.5 elements are there. There are some people, clairvoyants for example, they can see the ethereal aspect of matter. So some people in humanity are already developing the senses to perceive the fifth element. This is why we could say it's half manifested so far. But it will become more evident in the future. So remember for this that when we talk about rounds, we are talking about these 7 planets. We will need this for the next shlokas. So the Earth is the lowest of the planets, and the round is a round of evolution around each one of these globes. When life goes around all these globes, that is what we call the first round. Then there is a state of rest, and then there is a second round. So now the second element would begin to manifest, and at the end of the second round, the second element would be more fully manifested. Now, this doesn't mean that that second element is not going to be further developed in the next round. It will, but in a certain sense, the perfect expression or the most appropriate expression of the second element is during the second round. We will see this in regards to the Earth. Blavatsky says, in the beginning of this evolution of the planetary chain, neither water, air, earth, synonym for solids generally, here you see that she's correlating the element with the state of matter. In the beginning, none of these existed in their present form, representing the 3 states of matter alone recognized by science. At the time that Blavatsky was writing this, science didn't know anything about the 4th state of matter, plasma. Actually, the William Crookes, who was a scientist, he was a chemist, a physicist. He was a member of the Theosophical Society during Blavatsky's time, and he was working on what he called the fourth state of matter, that he called it radiant matter. And he is the one that set the basis for the discovery of plasma some decades later. So when Blavatsky was writing this, Crookes was beginning to discover the fourth state of matter, and Blavatsky was very aware of this. She mentions that in The Secret Doctrine, but that state had not been formally recognized yet in science. So she says at the beginning, none of these elements and also none of these states of matter on the physical plane were the same. For all these are the productions already recombined by the atmospheres of globes, completely formed, even to fire, so that in the first periods of the earth formation, all these elements and all these states of matter were something quite sui generis. Sui generis means of its own kind. So basically what she says is that not only the elements were different at the beginning of the earth, but also the states of matter were different. What we call solid at the beginning of the formation of the earth has nothing to do with the solid now. We know that the planet begins by being a mass of gas and fire and molten, substance, and it begins to cool and become more and more dense and concrete. So what, relatively speaking, in the first round was solid, has nothing to do with the solid now. As the rounds go down to the fourth, which is the one that we are at right now, everything becomes denser. And then as we move forward to the next rounds, everything will become subtler again. So it is interesting to mention here that Blavatsky gives a clue to solve the problem of something like the dinosaurs, for example. Currently, science, although they hardly ever mention it, there is a problem in science when we think of the dinosaurs, because for all we know, at the level of physics, dinosaurs would not be able to move with the massive sizes that they have. Some scientists are trying to postulate that actually the dinosaurs lived in an earth that was filled with water, and therefore the water made them, lighter and they could move. But that is a kind of crazy theory, because if that was so, then the dinosaurs would have some adaptations to move in the water. Why would they have, legs if there was water, at least to some degree? But the point is that in physics, force grows slower than volume, meaning something that is smaller in volume has more relative force than something that is bigger in volume. This is why an ant is able to lift many times its own weight, and an elephant is not even able to lift one time its own weight. The bigger something becomes, the more relatively weak it is. This has to do with the fact that force grows in a square rate and volume in a cube rate. So the result of this is that animals so big as the dinosaurs could not have enough strength to move their bodies and to move it even to the speed that they are supposed to move. Now, what Blavatsky explains is that the fossils that we find today are kind of crystallized forms, because the whole earth became more material, denser. She says that the dinosaurs, which were in the previous round, were far more ethereal, as the whole earth was. So they didn't have this problem with gravity and with the weight of their bodies. But then all these remains of the dinosaurs that were more ethereal, whatever that means, as the whole Earth began to go in the fourth round and the solid became more and more solid, or more and more material, denser, so did the fossils. Pretty much like what happens with the mineralized wood that we can find in even today. You have a petrified wood that looks just like a rock. Imagine that for some reason we didn't have wood any longer, and all we find is this petrified wood. We would be wondering, how could plants be alive when wood was like a rock? And so that the wood is now like a rock doesn't mean that it was so in the past. It's just a process of petrification that we call it. So Blavatsky postulates that something similar happened with the fossils of the dinosaurs. But the main point is this evolution of the elements, how everything, the whole system changes, and the solid in the first round, or what we call earth or fire in the first round, is very different from what we have today. And lastly, the shloka says 7 small wheels revolving, one giving birth to the other. And Blavatsky explains, by wheels, the various spheres and centers of forces are generally meant, but in this case, these refer to our septenary ring. These 7 wheels are our planetary chain. So there are 2 ways of interpreting this last sentence in the shloka that says 7 small wheels revolving. That means evolving, moving. Revolving gives the idea of a cycle. In the esoteric philosophy, the law of cycles is a fundamental law. As we were saying for the elements, this happens with everything. Things are not manifested in a linear way. Human beings are manifested in the way that they are right now. There were sketches of human beings in each one of the rounds, and those sketches were from sketches that were very, very subtle to the very concrete and complex form that human beings are now. And in further cycles, the development of human beings will again be sketched and fully developed in a cyclic way. So the small wheels revolving is referring to this cyclic evolution. And then when it says one giving birth to the other, there are 2 ways of interpreting this, I was saying. The way that we can talk about here with this diagram is the idea is that when the first globe develops in the planetary chain, as this globe evolves, then it emanates, so to say, a lower globe, which is the second globe. It gives birth to the next globe. The principles that were evolving on this first highest globe now are transferred to a lower globe, which is now formed little by little and develops in a way that can be a vehicle for the evolution of consciousness. Then this globe, at some point in its evolution, begins to emanate a lower globe. And this globe begins to emanate what we know as Earth. So everything, Blavatsky says, evolves from the inward outward, from the inner planes to the outer planes. So our Earth is an emanation of subtler globes. So this is one way in which we can interpret one wheel, the wheel meaning the globes in this case, giving birth to the other. Now there is a second way to interpret this, but this will be explained in the second half of this stanza, and we are going to explore that in our next meeting.